Hello, and thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of Paul's letter to Philemon as a part of our larger study of the neglected books of the New Testament. And we want to talk today about the connection between Philemon and the book of Colossians. These two letters seem to have been delivered at the same time and by the hands of the same people. We're told in chapter 4, verse 7, that Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondslave in the Lord, will bring you information, and with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. So Onesimus is the topic of the book of Philemon. And so these two guys have evidently come together to the church at Colossae and have delivered both letters at the same time. We have already noticed how the letter to Philemon is not just a personal letter, but in the greeting is addressed to the entire congregation. It's interesting as we look at some of the things that Paul says here, how he is tiptoeing around, maybe that's a bad phrase, how he's being very delicate in the way he handles the situation because he has to be. We learn from this letter that the church at Colossae is being attacked from the inside by false teachers who are teaching a very pernicious form of false teaching. And the letter to the Colossians really is my favorite of Paul's letters because it reads so much like 1 John. It's so deep theologically and so simply communicated theologically because it's a dicey situation. And we can tell from the letter to Philemon that Philemon is a faithful brother, that Philemon is one of the guys Paul needs there at that church and in good standing at that church to assert right and proper doctrine. And yet at the same time, as Paul writes the letter to Philemon, as we've mentioned so many times, he needs Philemon to man up and do the right thing when he doesn't really want to do the right thing in his personal life with one of the slaves of his household. Anyway, in the book of Colossians, Paul is so affirming at the beginning of his letter for all of them, and he says almost word for word some things that he says to Philemon personally. He says, he talks about, we give thanks to you always because we hear about the love that you have for all the saints. Those are not just throwaway lines or niceties. He's establishing for the congregation that we are all of us equals as Christians. That's important for those false teachers who are trying to say there are different levels of achievement in Christianity, different levels of enlightenment in Christianity, of maturity in Christianity that makes some people more so than others. But it also says to the slave owners, listen, your brother in Christ is your brother in Christ. You may have legal papers saying that you own this guy, but he's your brother in Christ, and he's your equal, and he's your peer. So he's saying both at the same time in this introduction. It's interesting because Colossians has a set of house rules, just like Ephesians does, and like 1 Peter does, in which he says, wives do this, husbands do this, parents do this, masters do this, and slaves do this. But in terms of talking about masters and servants, that part of the Colossian letter is so much shorter than it is in the Ephesian letter. And I think this is for two reasons. One is he's dealing with slaves and masters thoroughly in the book of Philemon. And the other is what he says is he covers all the bases but very briefly. He doesn't need to kick, the horse twice. All he says about slaves and masters is this: slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. And whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive consequences of the wrong he has done, and that without partiality. Masters, grant to your slaves justice, fairness, knowing that you have your own master in heaven. Now I said the slave part is longer, and one wonders whether he's saying to Onesimus, listen, if this doesn't work out the way we want it to, you better behave. um, but he also makes clear in that part that everybody's going to be judged about the decisions they make without partiality. And as he says to the slave, he says to the master, we serve a master in heaven. We're all bond slaves. And it's interesting that in the farewell, in chapter 4, everybody he mentions, he calls a bond slave to reinforce, to reiterate that we are all the same before God. A little more that we want to look at. He's called Onesimus faithful and beloved brother, and he says, when these two guys get there, they'll tell you everything I want you to know. He makes Onesimus an equal of Tychicus and makes him a spokesperson for Paul. So before all these things ever get written, he has given Onesimus the role of Paul, of his spokesperson, of Paul's spokesperson. That's enormous, and it's so important. And then there's a line at the end that, share these letters with the Laodiceans, and they're going to share their letter with you. Okay, so he's widening the circle of accountability. Also, there's one other phrase, which I just love this phrase. Say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. He's saying to the preacher there, do your job. Those are stern words coming from Paul, and they're at the tag end of this letter. Do your job, meaning face down the false teachers, meaning tell Philemon to do the right thing. Yes, all of the above. So there's an accountability brought to bear with Archippus as well. You do your job, buddy. And then he ends by saying, I've written this greeting in my own hand. He wrote the entire letter of Philemon in his own hand, which we've already mentioned. This is a very close connection. And I wish we had more time to talk about, the interplay, the themes that are so subtly communicated throughout, but that build up almost in a subconscious way, that build up, the better angels of our understanding, so that when you read the Philemon letter, you're ready to hear Paul's persuasion and to be moved by it. We're going to have one more lesson to talk about some conclusions that we take away from the book of Philemon. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes.